rubbed her teeth with salt and soda, then took a fresh shift and stockings from the small wooden chest at the foot of the cot. Her ring she left in the chest, tucked under everything else in a small velvet pouch. Another order. All of her things were here, except for her lap desk. Luckily that had been lost when she was taken. Her dresses hung on a cloak stand, the last of the room's furnishings. Choosing one without really looking, she put it on mechanically and used comb and brush on her hair. The ivory-backed brush slowed as she really saw herself in the washstand's cheap, bubbled mirror. Breathing raggedly, she set the brush down beside the matching comb. The dress she had chosen was thick, finely woven wool of an unadorned red so dark it seemed nearly black. Black, like an Ashaman's coat. Her distorted image stared back at her, lips writhing. Changing would be a sort of surrender. Determinedly, she snatched her marten-lined gray cloak from the stand. When she pushed aside the canvas door flap, 20 or so sisters already occupied the long central hallway lined with canvas rooms. Here and there a few were speaking in murmurs, but the rest avoided each other's eyes, even when they belonged to the same Aja. Fear had its presence, but it was shame that coated most faces. Akura, a stout gray, was staring at the hand where she normally wore her ring. Cassandra, a willowy yellow, was hiding her right hand in her armpit. The soft conversations trailed off when Tovane appeared. Several women glared at her openly, including Janara and Lamai from her own Aja. Cassandra came to herself enough to turn her back stiffly. In the space of 2 days, 51 Aes Sedai had fallen captive to the black-coated monsters, and 50 of them blamed Tovane Ghazal as though Elida Aroyhan had no hand in the disaster at all. Except for Loghain's intervention, they would have had their revenge their first night here. She did not love him for putting a stop to it, and making Carnila heal the welts left by belts, the bruises left by fists and feet. She would rather they had beaten her to death than owe him. Putting her cloak on her shoulders, she walked proudly down the corridor, out into pale morning sunshine that suited her washed-out mood. Behind her, someone shouted acid words before the closing door cut them off. Her hands trembled as she pulled up her hood, nestling the dark fur around her face. No one got away with pushing down Tovane Ghazal. Even Mistress Doweel, who had crushed her into a semblance of submission over the years, learned that, when her exile ended, she would show them. She would show them all. The dormitory she shared with the others lay on the very edge of a large village, if a very strange one. A village of Ashaman. Elsewhere, so she had been told, ground was marked off for structures they claimed would dwarf the White Tower, but this was where most of them lived now. 5 large, blocky stone barracks, spaced along streets as wide as anything in Tarvalin, could each hold 100 Ashaman soldiers. They were not full yet, the light be thanked, but snow-covered scaffolding awaited the arrival of workmen around the thick walls of 2 more that were almost ready for roofing and thatch. Nearly a dozen smaller stone structures were made to hold 10 dedicated each, and another of those was under construction too. Scattered around them stood nearly 200 houses that might have been seen in any village, where some of the married men lived, and the families of others not far enough along in training. Men who could channel did not frighten her. Once she had given in to panic for a moment, true, but that was beside the point. 500 men who could channel, however, were a scrap of bone wedged between 2 of her teeth where she could not free it. 500! And they could travel, some of them. A sharp scrap of bone. More, she had tramped the mile or more through the woods to the wall. That frightened her. What it signified. Nowhere was the wall finished. Nowhere more than 12 or 15 feet high. None of the towers or bastions more than begun. In places she could have clambered over the piles of black stone, except for her orders not to attempt escape. The thing ran for 8 miles, though, and she believed Loghain when he said it was begun less than 3 months ago. The man held her too tightly to bother with lying. He called the wall a waste of time and effort, and perhaps it was, but it made her teeth chatter. Just 3 months, made using the power, the male half of the power. When she thought of that black wall, she saw an implacable force that could not be stopped, an avalanche of black stones sliding down to bury the white tower. Impossible, of course. Impossible, but when she did not dream of strangling Elida, she dreamed of that.
Hey, Grandpa, how
There had
you
been
doing?
snowfall in the night, and a heavy blanket of white covered every
Appreciate it.
roof, but she did not have to pick her way along the broad streets.
How's your night
The
going,
hard-packed
Grandpa?
dirt had been cleared, a chore of men in training before the sun came up. They used the power for everything from filling wood boxes to cleaning their clothes. Black-clad men hurried here and there in the streets, and more were gathering in rows in front of
Hope
their
you're doing
barracks,
good,
with
Grandpa.
others calling roll in loud voices. Women bundled up against the cold walked past them, placidly carrying baskets to the quartermaster's storehouse or water buckets to the nearest fountain, though how any woman could remain, knowing what her husband was beyond Tovane's comprehension. Even more bizarre, children ran up and down the street, around the squares of men who could channel, shouting and laughing, rolling hoops, tossing painted balls, playing with dolls or dogs. A drop of normality that heightened the evil stench of the rest. Ahead of her, a mounted party was approaching up the street at a walk. In the short time she had been here, the endless time, she had not seen anyone ride in the village except workmen on carts or wagons,
Hell yeah.
nor any visitors,
How was
which
that,
some of these
Grandpa?
plainly must be. 5 men in black were escorting a dozen in the red coats and cloaks of the Queen's guards, with 2 yellow-haired women at the front, one in a red and white cloak lined with black fur, and the other... Tovane's eyebrows climbed. The other wore green kandori trousers and a coat made up as if it belonged to the Captain General of the Guard. Her red cloak even had golden knots of rank on the shoulder. Maybe she was mistaken about the men. That one would find short shrift when she encountered real guardsmen. In any case, it was strangely early for visitors. Each time the odd party reached one of the formations, the man in
Oh
front
shit,
shouted,
hell yeah.
"Ashaman, attend front," and
It
boot
was
heels
packed
stamped on the hardened
down.
earth as the others stiffened like pillars of stone. Pulling her hood forward better to hide her face, Tovane moved to the side of the wide street, close beside the corner of one of the smaller stone barracks. A fork-bearded old man coming out, a silver sword pin on his high collar, glanced at her curiously without slowing his stride. What she had done struck her like a bucket of cold water, and she nearly wept. None of those strangers would spot an Aes Sedai face now if they could recognize one. If either of those women could channel, unlikely though that was, she would not
Hell
pass
yeah,
close enough to
Grandpa.
tell that Tovane could,
Not
too.
too bad, can't
She
complain
fretted and
none.
fumed over how to disobey Logain, and then did everything necessary to carry out his instructions without even thinking about it. As an act of defiance, she stopped where she was, turning to watch the visitors. Automatically, her hands checked her hood before she could snatch them to her sides. It was pitiful and ridiculous. She knew the Ashaman guiding the party, by sight at least, a bulky man in his middle years with oily black hair, an oily smile, and eyes like augers. None of the others, though. What could she hope to gain by this? How could she entrust a message to any of them? Even if the escort vanished, how could she get close enough to pass a message when she was forbidden to let any outsider discover the presence of Aes Sedai? The auger-eyed fellow looked bored with his duty this morning, hardly bothering to hide his yawns behind a gloved hand. "When we do finish here," he was saying as he rode past Tovane, "I will show you the craft town, quite a bit bigger than this. We do have every kind of crafts folk, from masons and carpenters to metalsmiths and tailors. We can make everything we need, Lady Elaine." "Except turnips," one of the women said in a high voice, and the other laughed. Tovane's head jerked. She watched the riders move on down the street accompanied by shouted orders and stamping boots. Lady Elaine? Elaine Trakand? The younger of the pair might match the description she had been given. Elida did not reveal why she was so desperate to lay her hands on one runaway accepted, even one who might become a queen, but she never let a sister leave the tower without orders on her if she encountered the girl. "Careful, Elaine Trakand," Tovane said. "I would not like Elida to have the satisfaction of her hands on you." She wanted to think on this, on whether there was some way to
Hell
use the
yeah,
girl's presence
Grandpa.
here,
Definitely
but
appreciate
abruptly
it,
she
bro.
became aware of the sensations
Consider
at the
you
back
like a
of her
brother
head,
too.
a mild contentment and a growing purpose. Logain had finished his breakfast. He would be coming out soon. He had told her to be there when he did.
Oh,
Her
did
feet were
you?
running before she thought. With the
That's
result
why
that her skirts
I ended
tangled
up
in her
doing the
legs and
mine
she fell
too,
hard,
was
knocking her
lowering it
breath
to the
out.
lowest.
Anger welled up, fury, but she scrambled to her feet, and without pausing to brush off the dust, gathered her skirts above her knees and began to run again, cloak billowing behind. Men's raucous shouts followed her down the street, and
Just to
laughing
save
children
money.
pointed as she ran past. Suddenly a pack of dogs was around her, snarling, nipping at her heels. She leapt and spun and kicked, but they harried her. She wanted to shriek with frustration and fury. Dogs were always a bother, and she could not channel a feather to drive them off. A gray hound seized a mouthful of dangling skirt, pulling her sideways. Panic overwhelmed
I
everything
figured
else.
if I
If
want
she
to
fell
fight
again, they
game
would
out, I
tear
could
her to
just
shreds.
get one through
A
my
shouting
game
woman in
fly.
brown wool swung her heavy basket at the dog, tugging Tauvain's skirt, making it dodge away. A round woman's bucket caught a brindled cur in the ribs,
Hell
and it
yeah.
ran yelping. Tauvain
I
gaped
was
in
playing
astonishment, and for her inattention had to pull her left leg
Titan
away from
Quest,
another dog at the cost of a piece of her stocking and a little skin.
because they're supposed to
There
be
were
coming out
women
with
all
the Titan
around her,
Quest 2
flailing away at the
at the end
animals
of the
with
month.
whatever they had to hand. Go on
I
with
need to
you,
get
I
back
said
on
I,
Dragon
the
Age
skinny
though.
graying
I've been
woman told her,
slacking.
slicing at a spotted dog with a switch. They won't bother you more. I'd like a nice cat myself, but cats won't abide the husband now. Go on. Tauvain did not wait to thank her rescuers. She ran, considering furiously. The women knew. If one did, they all did. But they would carry no messages, give no help to an escape. Not when they were willing to remain themselves. Not if they understood what they were helping. There was that. Just short of Logain's house, one of several down a narrower side street, she slowed and hastily let down her skirts. 8 or 9 men in black coats were
Nice.
waiting outside, boys and
I still need
oldsters
to
and
get
in
Diablo
between,
4.
but there was no sign of
I don't have
Logain
it
yet.
right now.
She could still sense him,
I need
full of
to,
purpose,
just because
but
they had that
concentrated.
expansion that they came
Reading,
out with.
perhaps. She walked the rest of the way at a dignified pace, composed and every inch an Aes Sedai, no matter the circumstances. She almost managed to forget her frantic flight from the dogs. The house surprised her every time she saw it. Others on the street were as large and 2 larger. An ordinary wooden house of 2 stories, though the red door, shutters, and window
I
frames
have to wait till I
looked
get
odd.
the extra money because I
Plain
want to get
curtains hid the interior,
the
but the
digital
glass in the
copy
windows
of it.
was so poor she doubted she could have seen anything clearly with the curtains drawn. A house suitable for a not overly successful shopkeeper, hardly the dwelling for one of the most notorious men alive.
I think it's called Vessel
Briefly,
of
she wondered
Hatred.
what was keeping Gabriella. The other sister, bonded to Logain, had the same instructions
Yes.
she did, and until
Mainly
now she'd
because
always been here first.
it comes with
Gabriella was
another
eager,
character
studying the
class is why
Ashaman as
you
if
got
she
to pay
intended
for it.
writing a book on the subject. Perhaps she did. Browns would write about anything. She put the other sister out of her mind.
I think
Although, if Gabriella did turn up late, she would have to find out how the woman had managed it. For now, she had her own studying.
I guess the character that
The men outside the red door eyed her, but said nothing, even to each other. There was no
that you're
animosity.
getting,
They were
that
simply
comes with
pretty.
expansion, is supposed to be
None had a cloak, though their breath
a pretty
made
good
pale
one that's pretty
feathers in front of their
overpowered.
faces.
If you
All were dedicated,
build
with
it
the
right.
silver sword pin on their collars.
Well, that's
It
how it
had been
was
the
for
same
3
every
too.
morning she had
Whenever
reported this
when
way,
3
though
came
not
out, when
always
it
the
came out
same
with the
men.
expansion for
She
it, you
knew
had to pay
some,
for it,
knew
but
their
it also
names at
came with
least, and sometimes a few other gleaned
the
tidbits.
necromancer.
Evan Vinchova, the pretty
And the
lad who had been
necromancer
there
on
when
3
Logain
is
captured her,
if you
leaning
build
against
him
the
right,
corner of the house and toying with a bit of string.
it's
Donalo
he's pretty
Sandomir, if that was
OP'd.
his real name, with his creased farmer's face and sharply trimmed oiled beard, attempting the languid stance he thought a nobleman would assume. The Taraboner Androl Genhald, a square fellow with his heavy eyebrows drawn in thought and his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a gold signet ring, but she thought him an apprentice who had shaved his mustaches and abandoned his veil. Mezar Kurin, a Damani with gray at his temples, fingering the garnet in his left ear. He very well might be a miner. She was collecting a pile of names and faces in her head. Sooner or later they would be hunted down, and every piece of information that could help identify them would be useful. The red door opened, and the men straightened, but it was not Logain who came out. Tauvain blinked in surprise, then met Gabriella's sooty green eyes with a flat stare, making no effort to hide her disgust. That accursed link with Logain had made clear what he was up to the night before. She had been afraid she would never fall asleep, but not in her darkest imaginings had she suspected Gabriella. Some of the men seemed as startled as she. Some attempted to hide smiles.
Oh, are they? Nice.
Turin grinned openly and stroked his thin mustache with a thumb. The dusky woman did not even have the grace to blush. She lifted her upturned nose a trifle, then boldly adjusted her dark blue dress over her hips, as if to advertise that she had just donned the garment. Sweeping her cloak around her shoulders, she tied the ribbons as she glided towards Tovanes, as serene as if she were back in the tower. Tovanes grabbed the taller woman's arm, pulling her a little way from the men. "We may be captives, Gabriella," she whispered harshly, "but that is no reason to surrender, especially to Ablar's vile lusts."
Yeah, Grandpa, you have a great rest of your evening,
A
too.
thought came. Of course. Did he order you? With something close to a sneer, Gabriella pulled free. "Tovanes, it took me 2 days to decide I should surrender to his lusts, as you put it. I feel lucky it only required 4 to convince him to let me. You Reds might not be aware, but men love to talk
Grandpa,
and
you have a good evening.
All you need do is listen, or even pretend to, and a man will tell you his whole life." A thoughtful frown creased her forehead, and the twist to her lips vanished. "I wonder whether it's like that for ordinary women." "Whether what is like what?" Tovanes demanded. Gabriella was spying on him? Or just trying to get more material for her book? But this was unbelievable, even for a Brown. "What are you talking about?" That musing expression never left the other's face. I felt helpless. Oh, he was gentle, but I never really thought before on how strong a man's arms are, and me unable to channel a whisker. He was in charge, I suppose, though that isn't quite right. Just stronger, and I knew it. It felt strangely exhilarating. Tovanes shuddered. Gabriella must be insane. She was about to tell her so when Logain himself appeared, closing the door behind him. He was tall, taller than any other man there, with dark hair that brushed wide shoulders and framed an arrogant face. His high collar carried both the silver sword and that ridiculous snake with legs. He flashed a smile at Gabriella as the others gathered around him. The hussy smiled back, too. Tovanes shuddered again. Exhilarating. The woman was insane. As on previous mornings, the men began making reports. Most of the time, Tovanes had not been able to make up from down with them, but she listened. "I found 2 more who seem interested in that new kind of healing this Nynaeve used on you, Logain," Genhald said, frowning. "But one can barely do the healing we already know, and the other, he wants to know more than I could tell him." "What you can tell him is all I know," Logain replied. "Mistress Almira didn't tell me much of what she was doing, and I could only learn bits and pieces listening to the other sisters talk. Just keep planting the seed and hope something grows. It's all you can do." Several other men nodded along with Genhald. Tovanes filed it away. Nynaeve Almira. She had heard that name often after returning to the tower. Another runaway accepted. Another one Elida wanted more than the normal desire to catch runaways seemed to account for. From the same village as Althor, too, and associated somehow with Logain. That might lead to something eventually. But a new kind of healing, used by an accepted? That was unlikely, bordering close on impossible, but she had seen the impossible happen before, so she tucked it away. Gabriella was listening closely, too, she noticed, but watching her as well, out of the corner of her eye. "There's a problem with some of those 2 Rivers men, Logain," Vinchova said. An angry flush rose on his smooth face. "Men, I say, but these 2 are boys, 14 at most." He might have been a year or 2 older, with his beardless cheeks. "It was a crime bringing them here." Logain shook his head. Whether in anger or regret, it was hard to say. "I've heard the White Tower takes girls as young as 12. Look after the 2 Rivers men where you can. No coddling or the others will turn on them, but try to see they don't do anything stupid. The Lord Dragon might not like it if we kill too many from his district." "He doesn't seem to be caring much at all, as I can see," a sleek fellow muttered. The sound of Murandy was strong in his mouth, though his fiercely curled mustaches told where he was from plainly enough. He was rolling a silver coin across the backs of his fingers, and seemed as intent on that as on Loghain. "I was hearing it was the Lord Dragon himself told the Mahale to pluck up anything male in this 2 rivers that could channel down to the roosters. With the number he brought back, I'm just surprised he didn't bring the chicks and lambs as well." Chuckles met his sally, but Loghain's level tones cut them like a blade. "Whatever the Lord Dragon ordered, I trust I've made my orders clear." Every head nodded this time, and some men murmured, "Yes, Loghain," and "As you say, Loghain." Tovane hastily smoothed the sneer from her lips. Ignorant louts. The tower accepted girls under 15 only if they had already begun channeling. The others were interesting, though. The 2 rivers again. Everyone said Althor had turned his back on his home, but she was not so certain. Why was Gabriella watching her? "Last night," Sandomir said after a moment, "I learned that Mishraila is having private lessons from the Mahale." He stroked his pointed beard with satisfaction, as if he had produced a gem of great price. Perhaps he had, but Tovane could not say what kind. Loghain nodded slowly. The others exchanged silent looks with faces that might have been carved. She chewed frustration, watching. Too often it was like this, matters they saw no reason to comment on, or feared to, and she did not understand. She always felt there were gems hidden there beyond her reach. A wide Kyrianan fellow, barely as tall as Loghain's chest, opened his mouth, but whether he meant to speak of Mishraila, whoever he was, she never found out. "Loghain!" Wellin Kajima pounded down the street at a dead run, the bells at the ends of his black braids jangling. Another dedicated, a man in his middle years who smiled too much. He had been there when Loghain captured her, too. Kajima had bonded Janara. He was almost out of breath when he pushed through the other men, and he was not smiling now. "Loghain," he panted, "the Mahale's back from Kyrian, and he's posted new deserters on the board of the palace. You won't believe the names." He spilled out his list in a breathless rush amid exclamations from the others that kept Tovane from hearing more than fragments. "Dedicated have deserted before," the Kyrianan muttered when Kajima was done, "but never a full Ashaman. And now 7 at once." "If you don't believe me," Kajima began, drawing himself up in a fussy manner. He had been a clerk in Arafel. "We believe you," Genhald said soothingly. "But Gedwin and Torval, they are the Mahale's men. Rochide and Kisman, too. Why would they desert? He gave them anything a king could want." Kajima shook his head irritably, making his bells chime. "You know the list never gives reasons, just names." "Good riddance," Kurin growled. "At least it would be if we didn't have to hunt them down now." "It's the others I cannot understand," Sandomir put in. "I was at Dumai's wells. I saw the Lord Dragon choose after. Dashiva had his head in the clouds like always, but Flynn, Hopwell, Narishma, you never saw men more pleased. They were like lambs let loose in the barley shed." A sturdy fellow with gray in his hair spat. "Well, I wasn't at the wells, but I went south against Shonchan." His accents were Andorran. "Maybe the lambs didn't like the butcher's yard as much as they did the barley shed." Loghain had been listening without taking part, arms folded across his chest. His face was unreadable, a mask. "Do you worry about the butcher's yard, Candler?" he said now. The Andorran grimaced, then shrugged. "I reckon we're all headed there soon or late, Loghain. Don't see we have much choice, but I don't have to grin about it." "As long as you're there on the day," Loghain said quietly. He addressed the man called Candler, but several of the others nodded. Looking past the men, Loghain considered Tovane and Gabriella. Tovane tried to look as if she had not been eavesdropping and remembering names fiercely. "Go inside out of the cold," he told them. "Have some tea to warm you. I'll be back as soon as I can. Don't touch my papers." Gathering up the other men with a gesture, he led them off in the direction Kajima had come from. Tovane gritted her teeth in frustration. At least she would not have to follow him to the training ground, past the so-called traitor's tree, where heads hung like diseased fruit from the bare branches, and watch men studying how to destroy with the power. But she had hoped for another day to herself. free to wander about and see what she could learn. She had heard men speak of Chinese palace before, and today she hoped to find it and perhaps catch a glimpse of the man whose name was as black as Logan. Instead, she meekly followed the other woman through the red door. There was no use fighting it. Inside, she looked around the front room while Gabriella hung her cloak on a peg. Despite the exterior, she had expected something different for Logan. A low fire burned in a rough stone fireplace. A long, narrow table and ladder-backed chairs stood on bare floorboards. A desk, only slightly more elaborate than the other furnishings, caught her eye. Stacks of lidded letterboxes littered the desktop, and leather folders full of long sheets of paper. Her fingers itched, but she knew that even if she sat at the desk, she would not be able to lay a finger on anything more than the pen or glass ink bottle. With a sigh, she followed Gabriella into the kitchen, where an iron stove gave too much heat. Dirty breakfast dishes sat on a low cabinet beneath the window. Gabriella filled a tea kettle and put it on the stove, then took a green glass teapot and a wooden canister from another cabinet. Tovane draped her cloak over a chair and sat down at the square table. She did not want tea unless it came with the breakfast she had missed, but she knew she was going to drink it. The silly brown nattered on as she carried out her domestic tasks like a contented farm wife. I've learned a good deal already. Logan is the only full Ashaman to live here in this village. The others all live in Taim's palace. They have servants, but Logan hired the wife of a man in training to cook and clean for him. She'll be here soon, and she thinks he put the sun in the sky, so we'd best be done talking anything important by then. He found your lap desk. Tovane felt as though an icy hand had seized her throat. She tried to hide it, but Gabriella was looking straight at her. He burned it, Tovane, after reading the contents. He seemed to think he had done us a favor. The hand eased, and Tovane could breathe again. Elida's order was among my papers. She cleared her throat to rid herself of hoarseness. Elida's order to gentle every man found here and then hang them on the spot, without the trial in Tarvalin required by Tower law. She imposed harsh conditions, and these men would have reacted harshly if they knew. In spite of the heat from the stove, she shivered. That single paper could have gotten them all stilled and hanged. Why would he do us favors? I don't know why, Tovane. He isn't a villain, no more than most men. It could be as simple as that. Gabriella set a plate of crusted rolls and another with white cheese on the table. Or it could be that this bond is like the Warder bond in more ways than we know. Maybe he just did not want to experience the two of us being executed. Tovane's stomach rumbled, but she picked up a roll as if she did not care for more than a nibble. I suspect harsh was a mild choice of words, Gabriella went on, spooning tea into the teapot. I saw you flinch. Of course, they went to a great deal of trouble to bring us here. 51 sisters in their midst, and even with the bond, they must fear we'll find some way around their orders, some loophole they missed. The obvious answer is, if we were dead, the tower would be roused to fury. With us alive and captive, even Elida will move cautiously. She laughed, quietly amused. Your face, Tovane. Did you think I've spent all my time thinking about tangling my fingers in Logain's hair? Tovane closed her mouth and put down the untouched roll. It was cold, anyway, and felt hard. Always a mistake to assume Browns were unworldly, absorbed in their books and studies to the exclusion of everything else. What else have you seen? Still gripping the spoon, Gabriella sat across the table from her and leaned forward intently. Their wall may be strong when it's done, but this place is full of fractures. There is Mazrim Taim's faction and Logain's faction, though I am uncertain either thinks of them so. Perhaps other factions too, and certainly men who don't know there are factions. 51 sisters should be able to make something of that, even with the bond. The second question is, what do we make of it? The second question, Tovane demanded, but the other woman merely waited. If we manage to break those fissures open, she said finally, we scatter 10 or 50 or 100 bands across the world, each more dangerous than any army ever seen. Catching them all might take a lifetime and rip the world apart like a new breaking, and that with Tarman Gaiden on its way. That is, if this fellow Al4 really is the Dragon Reborn. Gabriella opened her mouth, but Tovann waved away whatever she was going to say. That he was, very likely. It hardly mattered, here and now. But if we don't, put down the rebellion and gather those sisters back to the tower, call back every retired sister, and I don't know whether all of us together could destroy this place. I suspect half the tower would die in the attempt either way. What is the first question? Gabriella leaned back in her chair, her face suddenly weary. Yes, not an easy decision. And they bring in more men every day. 15 or 20 since we've been here, I believe. I won't be trifled with, Gabriella. What is the first question? The Brown's gaze sharpened, stared at her for a long moment. Soon the shock will wear off, she said finally. What comes then? The authority Elida gave you is finished. The expedition is finished. The first question is, are we 51 sisters united, or do we revert to being browns and reds, yellows and greens and grays? And poor Ayako, who must be regretting that the whites insisted on having a sister included. Lamai and Cassandra stand highest among us. Gabriella waved the spoon in admonishment. The only chance we have of holding together is if you and I publicly submit to Cassandra's authority. We must. That will start it at any rate, I hope. If we can only bring a few others to begin with, it will be a start. Tovann drew a deep breath and pretended to stare at nothing, as if considering. Submitting to a sister who stood higher than she was no hardship in itself. The Ajas had always kept secrets, and sometimes schemed a little against one another, but the open dissension in the tower now appalled her. Besides, she had learned how to be humble before Mistress Doweel. She wondered how the woman enjoyed poverty, and working on a farm for a taskmistress even harsher than herself. I can bring myself to it, she said finally. We should have a plan of action to present to Cassandra and Lamai if we mean to convince them. She already had one partly formed, if not for presentation to anyone. Oh, the water is boiling, Gabriella. Suddenly smiling, the foolish woman rose and hurried to the stove. Browns always were better reading books than people, come to think of it. Before Loghain and Taim and the rest were destroyed, they would help Tovann Ghazal bring down Elida.
The great city of Cairhien was a hulking mass inside massive walls, crowding the river Alguenia. The sky was clear and cloudless, but a cold wind blew, and the sun shone on roofs covered with snow, glinted on icicles that showed no sign of melting. The Alguenia was not frozen, but small, jagged ice floes from farther upstream spun in the currents, now and then banging against the hulls of ships waiting their turns at the docks. Trade slowed for winter and wars, and the dragon reborn. But it never really stopped. Not until nations died. Despite the cold, wagons and carts and people flowed along streets that razored the terraced hills of the city. The city, it was called here. In front of the square-towered Sun Palace, a crowd jammed together around the long entry ramp and stared up. Merchants wrapped in fine woolens, and nobles in velvets rubbing shoulders with grimy-faced laborers and dirtier refugees. No one cared who stood next to him, and even the cut-purses forgot to follow their trade. Men and women departed, often shaking their heads, but others took their places, sometimes hoisting a child to get a better view of the palace's ruined wing, where workmen were clearing away the rubble of the third story. Throughout the rest of Cairhien, craftsmen's hammers and creaking axles filled the air, together with the cries of shopkeepers, the complaints of buyers, the murmurs of merchants. The crowd before the Sun Palace was silent. A mile from the palace, Rand stood at a window in the grandly named Academy of Cairhien, peering through the frosted panes at the stone-paved stable-yard below. There had been schools called academies in Arthur Hawkwing's time, and before. Centers of learning filled with scholars from every corner of the known world. The conceit made no difference. They could have called it the barn, so long as it did what he wanted. More important concerns filled his thoughts. Had he made a mistake, returning to Cairhien so soon? But he had been forced to flee too quickly, so it would be known in the right quarters that he actually had fled. Too quickly to prepare everything. There were questions he needed to ask, and tasks that could not be put off. and Min wanted more of Master Fell's books. He could hear her muttering to herself as she rummaged through the shelves where they had been stored after Fell's death. With the bounty for books and manuscripts it did not yet possess, the Academy's library was fast outgrowing the rooms that could be spared in Lord Barthanas's former palace. Alana sat in the back of his head, sulking, it seemed. She would know he was in the city. This near, she would be able to walk straight to him. But he would know if she tried. Blessedly, Luz Theron was silent for the moment. Of late, the man seemed madder than ever. He rubbed a spot clear on a window pane with his coat sleeve. Stout, dark gray wool, good enough for a man with a little money and few heirs. It was not a garment anyone would expect to see on the Dragon Reborn. The golden-maned dragon's head on the back of his hand glittered metallically. It presented no danger here. His boot touched the leather scrip, sitting below the window, as he leaned forward to look out. In the stable yard, the paving stones had been swept clear of snow, and a large wagon stood surrounded by buckets like mushrooms in a clearing. Half a dozen men in heavy coats and scarves and caps seemed to be working on the wagon's odd cargo, mechanical devices crowded around a fat metal cylinder that took up more than half the wagon bed. Even stranger, the wagon shafts were missing. One of the men was moving split firewood from a large wheelbarrow into the side of a metal box fastened below one end of the big cylinder. The open door in the box glowed with the red of fire inside, and smoke rose from a tall, narrow chimney. Another fellow danced around the wagon, bearded, capless, and bald-headed, gesturing and apparently shouting orders that did not seem to make the others move any faster. Their breath made faint white plumes. It was almost warm inside. The Academy had large furnaces in the cellars and an extensive system of vents. The half-healed, never-healing wounds in his side were hot. He could make out Min's curses. He was sure they were curses, but her tone was enough to say they would not be leaving yet unless he dragged her away. There were one or two items he might ask about still. What are people saying about the palace? What you might expect, Lord Dobrain answered behind him with level patience, as he had answered all the other questions. Even when he admitted a lack of knowledge, his tone had not changed. Some say the Forsaken attacked you, or that I said I did. Those who think you swore fealty to the Amaran seat favor the Forsaken. Either way, there is considerable debate on whether you are dead or kidnapped or fled. Most believe you live, wherever you are, or say they do. Some, a good many I fear, think... His voice faded to silence. That I've gone mad, Rand finished for him in the same level tone. Not a matter for concern or anger. That I destroyed part of the palace myself? He would not speak of the dead. Fewer than other times, other places, but enough, and some of their names appeared whenever he closed his eyes. One of the men below climbed down from the wagon. The bald fellow caught his arm and dragged him back up, making him show what he had done. A man on the other side jumped to the pavement carelessly, skidding, and the capless man abandoned the first to chase around the wagon and make that one climb back up with him. What in the light could they be doing? Rand glanced over his shoulder. They're not far wrong. Dobrain Taberwin, a short man with the front of his head shaved and formally powdered, and the rest of his hair nearly all gray, looked back with dark, impassive eyes. Not a handsome man, but steady. Blue and white stripes marched down the front of his dark velvet coat from his neck almost to his knees. His signet ring was a carved ruby, and he wore another at his collar, not much larger, yet flamboyant for a Kyrianan. He was high seat of his house, with more battles behind him than most, and not much frightened him. He had proved that at Dumais Wells. But then, the stocky, graying woman patiently waiting her turn at his shoulder appeared just as unafraid. In sharp contrast to Dobrain's noble elegance, Idrian Tarson's sensible brown woolens were plain enough for a shopkeeper, yet she had her own well of authority and dignity. Idrian was headmistress of the Academy, the title she had given herself since most of the scholars and mechanics called themselves master of this or mistress of that. She ran the school with a strong hand and believed in practical things, new methods of surfacing roads or making dyes, improvements to foundries and mills. She also believed in the Dragon Reborn. Whether or not that was practical, it was pragmatic, and he would settle for that. He turned back to the window and cleared his patch on the glass again. Maybe it was for heating water. Some of those buckets seemed to have water in them still. In Shinar, they used big boilers to heat water for the baths. But why on a wagon? Has anyone left suddenly since I went, or come unexpectedly? He did not expect that anyone had, anyone of importance to him. Between merchants' pigeons and White Tower eyes and ears, and Mazarim Taim, he must not forget Taim. Luz Theron snarled wordlessly at the name. With all those pigeons and spies and babbling tongues, in a few more days the whole world would be aware that he had vanished from Cairhien. All the world that mattered, here and now. Cairhien was no longer the ground where the battle would be fought. Dobrain's answer surprised him. No one except Ailil Riatin and some high sea folk official are both missing since the attack. A bare pause, but a pause. Perhaps he was not so sure what had happened either. Yet he would keep his word. He had proved that at Dumai's Wells, too. No bodies were found, but they may have been killed. The Seafolk Wave Mistress refuses to countenance the possibility, though. She is raising a storm with demands that her woman be produced. In truth, Ailil may have fled to the countryside, or gone to join her brother, despite her pledges to you. Your three Ashaman are still in the Sun Palace: Flynn, Narishma, and Hopwell. They make people nervous, more so now than before. The headmistress made a sound in her throat, and her shoes shifted audibly on the floorboards.
Right back.
They certainly made her nervous. Bran dismissed the Ashaman. Unless much closer than the palace, none was strong enough to have felt him open a gateway here. Those three had not been part of the attack on him, but a wise planner might have considered the chance of failure, planned how to keep someone close to him if he survived. You won't survive, Luz Theron whispered. None of us will survive. Go back to sleep, Rand thought irritably. He knew he was not going to survive, but he wanted to. A derisive laugh answered in his head, but the sound thinned and was gone. The bald man was letting the others climb down now, rubbing his hands together in a pleased fashion. Of all things, the fellow seemed to be giving a speech. Ailil and Shallan are alive, and they didn't flee, Rand said aloud. He had left them bound and gagged, stuffed under a bed, where they would have been found by servants in a few hours, though the shield he had woven on the Seafolk Windfinder would have dissipated before that. The two women should have been able to free themselves then. Look to Cadsuane. She'll have them in Lady Arlen's palace. Cadsuane Sedai is in and out of the Sun Palace, as if it were her own, Dobrain said judiciously. But how could she have taken them out unseen? And why? Ailil is Torum's sister, yet his claim to the Sun Throne is dust now, if it was ever more. She is unimportant even as a counter now. As for holding an Atha'an Mier of high rank, to what purpose? Rand made his voice light, uncaring. Why is she keeping Lady Caroline and High Lord Darvin as guests, Dobrain? Why do Aes Sedai do anything? You'll find them where I said, if she lets you in to look. Why was not a foolish question. He just did not have the answer. Of course, Caroline Damodred and Ailil Riatin did represent the last two houses to hold the Sun Throne, and Darlin Cisnera led the nobles in Tyr, who wanted him thrown out of their precious stone, out of Tyr. Rand frowned. He had been sure Cadsuane was focused on him despite her pretense otherwise. But what if it was not pretense? A relief, if so. Of course it was. The last thing he needed was an Aes Sedai who thought she could meddle in his affairs. The very last. Perhaps Cadsuane was directing her meddling elsewhere. Min had seen Cisnera wearing a strange crown. Rand had thought a great deal of that viewing of hers. He did not want to think of other things she had seen concerning himself and the Green Sister. Could it be as simple as Cadsuane thinking she could decide who would rule both Tyr and Cairhien? Simple? He almost laughed. That was how Aes Sedai behaved. And Shallan, the Windfinder. Possessing her might give Cadsuane leverage with Harina, the Wave Mistress, but he suspected she had just been scooped up with Halil to try hiding who took the noble woman. Cadsuane would have to be disabused. Who would rule in Tyr and Cairhien had already been decided. He would point that out to her. Later. It stood far down his list of priorities. Before I go, Dobrain, I need to give you... Words froze on his tongue. In the stable yard, the capless man had pulled a lever on the wagon, and one end of a long horizontal beam suddenly rose, then sank, driving a shorter beam down through a hole cut in the wagon bed. And, vibrating till it seemed ready to shake apart, trailing smoke from the chimney, the wagon lurched ahead, the beam rising and falling, slowly at first, then faster. It moved without horses. He did not realize he had spoken aloud until the headmistress answered him. Oh, that's Mervyn Poe's steam wagon, as he calls it, my Lord Dragon. Disapproval freighted her high, startlingly youthful voice. Claims he can pull 100 wagons with the contraption. Not unless he can make it go further than 50 paces without bits breaking or freezing up. It has only done that far once, that I know. Indeed, the steam wagon shuddered to a halt not 20 paces from where it first stood. Shuddered indeed. It seemed to be shaking harder by the heartbeat. Most of the men swarmed over it again, one of them frantically twisting at something with a cloth wrapped around his hand. Abruptly, steam shot into the air from a pipe, and the shuddering slowed, stopped. Rand shook his head. He remembered seeing this fellow Mervyn with a device that quivered on a tabletop and did nothing. And this marvel had come from that. He had thought it was meant to make music. That must be Mervyn leaping about and shaking his fists at the others. Odd things. Were people building here at the academy? He asked, still watching the work on the wagon. Idrian sniffed loudly. Respect for the Dragon Reborn held only a thin edge in her voice as she began, and quickly lost ground to disgust. Bad enough I must give space to philosophers and historians, and arithmetists and the like. But you said take in anyone who wanted to make anything new and let them stay if they showed progress. I suppose you hoped for weapons, but now I have dozens of dreamers and wastrels on my hands, everyone with an old book or manuscript or 6, all of which date back to the Compact of the 10 Nations mind, if not the Age of Legends itself, or so they say. And they are all trying to send drawings and sketches and descriptions of things they've never seen, and nobody ever did see. I've seen old manuscripts with their eyes in their bellies, and animals 10 feet tall with tusks longer than a man, and cities where... But what are they making, Headmistress Tarson? Rand demanded. The men working on the thing below moved with an air of purpose, not as if they saw failure. And it had moved. She sniffed louder this time. Foolishness, my Lord Dragon. That is what they make. Kin Tovir constructed his big looking glass. You can see the moon through it, plain as your hand. And what he claims are other worlds. But what is the good of that? He wants to build a bigger now. Meryl Harka makes huge kites she calls gliders, and come spring she'll be throwing herself off hills again. Put your heart in your mouth to see her sailing downhill on the things. She will break more than her arm next time one folds up on her, I warrant. Jander Parentakis believes he can move riverboats with water wheels off a mill, or near enough. But when he put enough men into the boat to turn the cranks, there was no room for cargo, and any craft with sails could outrun it. And Hara traps lightning in big jars. I doubt even he knows why. And Nico Takama is just as silly with her. Rand spun around so fast that she stepped back, and even though Brain shifted on his feet, a swordsman's move. No, they were not sure of him at all. He traps lightning? He asked quietly. Comprehension flooded her blunt face, and she waved her hands in front of her. No, not like that. Not like you, she had almost said. It is a thing of wires and wheels and big clay jars, and the light knows what. He calls it lightning, and I saw a rat jump down on one of the jars once, on the metal rods sticking out of the top. It certainly looked struck by lightning. A hopeful tone entered her voice. I can make him stop if you wish. He tried to picture someone riding on a kite, but the image was ludicrous. Catching lightning in jars was beyond his ability to imagine. And yet, let them go on as before, Headmistress. Who knows? Maybe one of those inventions will turn out to be important. If any work is claimed, give the inventor a reward. Dobrain's leathery, sun-darkened face looked dubious, though he almost managed to conceal it. Idrian bowed her head in sullen assent, and even curtsied, but plainly she thought he was asking to let pigs fly if they could. Rand was not certain he disagreed. Then again, maybe one of the pigs would grow wings. The wagon had moved. He wanted very badly to leave something behind, something to help the world survive the new breaking the prophecies said he would bring. The trouble was, he had no idea what that might be, save for the squares themselves. Who knew what a marvel could do? Light, he wanted to build something that could last. I thought I could build, Luce Theron murmured in his head. I was wrong. We are not builders, not you or I, or the other one. We are destroyers. Destroyers. Rand shivered and scrubbed his hands through his hair. The other one? At times the voice sounded sanest when it was the most mad. They were watching him, Dobrain very nearly hiding uncertainty, Idrian making no effort to. Straightening as if nothing was wrong, he drew 2 slim packets from inside his coat. Both carried the dragon in a long lump of red wax on the outside. The belt buckle he was not wearing at the moment served for an impressive signet. The top one names you my steward in Carian, he said, handing the packets to Dobrain. A third, still nestled next to his chest, for Gregorin den Loshenos, making him steward in Ilion. So there'll be no trouble with anyone questioning your authority while I'm gone. Dobrain could handle that sort of trouble with his armsmen, but best to make sure no one could claim ignorance or doubt. Maybe there would be no trouble to handle if everyone believed the Dragon Reborn would descend on transgressors. There are orders about things I want done, but aside from those, use your own judgment. When the Lady Elaine lays claim to the Sun Throne, throw your full support behind her. Elaine. Oh, Light, Elaine, and Avienda. At least they were safe. Min's voice sounded happier now. She must have found Master Fell's books. He was going to let her follow him to her death. He was strong enough to stop her. Elena, Luce Theron moaned. Forgive me, Elena. Rand's voice came out as cold as winter's heart. You'll know when to deliver the other. Whether to deliver it. Pry him out, if need be, and decide by what he says. If you decide no, or he refuses, I'll pick someone else, not you. Perhaps that was brusque, but Dobrain's expression hardly changed. His eyebrows rose slightly at the name written on the second packet, that was all. He made a smooth bow. Carianan usually were smooth. It shall be as you say. Forgive me, but you sound as though you mean to be gone a long while. Rand shrugged. He trusted the High Lord as far as he trusted anyone. Almost as far. Who can say? The times are uncertain. Make sure Headmistress Tarson has whatever coin she needs, and the men starting the school in Camelin. The school in Tyr as well, until matters changed there. I do say, Dobrain repeated, tucking the packets into his coat. His face betrayed no emotion now. An experienced player in the game of houses was Dobrain. For her part, the headmistress managed to look pleased and disgruntled at the same time, and busied herself smoothing her dress unnecessarily, the way women did when hard-pressed not to speak their minds. Complain how she would about dreamers and philosophers, she was jealous of the Academy's well-being. She would shed no tears if those other schools vanished, and their scholars were forced to come to the Academy, even the philosophers. What would she think of one particular order in Dobrain's packet? I found everything I need, Min said, coming out from the shelves, staggering slightly under the weight of the 3 bulging cloth scrips that hung from her. Her plain brown coat and breeches were very like what she had worn when he first saw her in Bearlan. For some reason, she had grumbled over them until anyone who knew her would have thought he was asking her to put on a dress. She smiled now, though, with delight and a hint of mischief. I hope those pack horses are where we left them, or my Lord Dragon will have to be fitted for a pack saddle. Idrian gasped, scandalized to hear him addressed so, but Dobrain merely smiled a little. He had seen men around Rand before. Rand got rid of them as quickly as possible, since they had heard and seen as much as he wanted them to, sent them off with a final admonition that he had never been there at all. Dobrain nodded as if he had expected no less. Idrian looked thoughtful as she left. If she let anything slip where a servant could hear, or a scholar, it would be all over the city in 2 days. There was not much time in any case. Perhaps no one who could tell had been close enough to feel him open a gateway here, but anyone looking for the signs would be sure by now there was a Taviran in the city. It was not his plan to be found yet. When the door closed behind them, he studied Min for a moment, then took one of the scripts and slung it from his shoulder. Only one, she said. Setting the others on the floor, she planted her fists on her hips and scowled. Sometimes you really are a sheep herder. These bags must be 100 weight each. But she sounded more amused than upset. You should have picked smaller books, he told her, pulling on riding gloves to hide the dragons. Or lighter. He turned toward the window to fetch the leather scrip, and a wave of dizziness hit him. Knees turning to water, he stumbled. A shimmering face he could not make out flashed through his head. With an effort, he caught himself, forced his legs straight, and the whirling sensation vanished. Luce Theron panted hoarsely in the shadows. Could the face be his? If you think you'll make me carry them all that way, think again, Min grumbled. I've seen better pretending from stable hands. You could try falling down. Not this time. He was ready for what happened when he channeled. He could control it to some extent. Usually. Most of the time. This dizziness without Saidin was new. Maybe he had just turned too fast. And maybe pigs did fly. He settled the leather script's strap over his free shoulder. The men in the stable yard were still busy. Building. Min. Her brows lowered immediately. She paused for an instant in drawing on her red gloves and began tapping her foot. A dangerous sign with any woman, especially one who carried knives. We had this out, Rand Bloody Dragon Reborn Althor. You are not leaving me behind. The thought never crossed my mind, he lied. He was too weak. He could not make himself say the words to make her stay. Too weak, he thought bitterly. And she might well die for it. The light burned me forever. It will, Luce Theron promised softly. I just thought you should know what we've been doing, and what we are going to do, Rand went on. I haven't been very forthcoming, I suppose. Gathering himself, he seized Saidin. The room seemed to whirl, and he rode the avalanche of fire and ice and filth with nausea seething in his belly. He was able to stand erect without swaying, though. Barely. And just able to weave the flows of a gateway that opened into a snowy clearing where 2 saddled horses were tethered to a low branch of an oak. He was glad to see the animals still there. The clearing was well away from the nearest road, but there were still wanderers who had turned their backs on families and farms, trades and crafts, because the Dragon Reborn had broken all bonds. The prophecies said so. On the other hand, a good many of those men and women, footsore and half frozen now on top of it, were tired of searching without any notion of what they were searching for. Even these nondescript mounts surely would have vanished with the first man to find them unattended. He had gold enough to buy others, but he did not think Min would have enjoyed the hour's walk to the village where they had left the pack horses. Hurrying through into the clearing, pretending the change from floor to knee-deep snow caused his stumble, he only waited until she had snatched up her bags of books and staggered through after him before releasing the power. They were 500 miles from Kyrian and nearer Tarvalon than anywhere else of note. Alana had faded in his head when the gateway closed. Forthcoming, Min said, sounding suspicious. Of his motives, he hoped, or anything but the truth. The dizziness and nausea faded slowly. You have been as open as a mussel, Rand, but I am not blind. First we traveled to Rudion, where you asked so many questions about this Shara place that anybody would think you meant to go there. She shook her head as she fastened one of her burdens to the saddle of her brown gelding. She grunted with the effort, but she was not about to get books down in the snow. I never thought the Aiel Waste was like that. That city is bigger than Tarvalon, even if it is half ruined. And all those fountains in the lake, I couldn't even see the far side. I thought there wasn't any water in the waste, and it was as cold as here. I thought the waste was hot. In summer, you fry during the day, but you still freeze at night. He felt recovered enough to begin shifting his own burdens to the Gray's saddle. Almost enough. He did it anyway. If you already know everything, what was I doing besides asking questions? The same as in Tyr last night. Making sure every cat and blackbird knew you were there. In Tyr, it was Chachin you asked about. It's obvious. You are trying to confuse anyone who tries to find out where you are and where you're going next. The second bag of books balancing the first behind her saddle, she untied her reins and climbed into the saddle. So, your eyes belong on an eagle. He hoped his pursuers saw as clearly. Or that whoever directed them did. It would not do to have them herring off the light knew where. I need to lay some more false trails, I think. Why take the time? I know you have a plan. I know it concerns something in that leather script. A sangria? And I know it's important. Don't look so surprised. You barely let that bag out of your sight. Why not go ahead and do whatever it is you plan, then lay your false trails? And the real one, of course. You're going to turn on them when they least expect you, you said. You can hardly do that unless they follow where you want. I wish you'd never started reading Harriet Fell's books, he muttered sourly, pulling himself into the gray saddle. His head spun only a little. You puzzle out too much. Can I keep any secrets at all from you now? You never could, Woolhead, she laughed, and then, contradicting herself, what are you planning? Aside from killing Deshiva and the rest, I mean. I have a right to know if I'm traveling with you. As if she had not insisted on traveling with him. I'm going to cleanse the male half of the source, he said in a flat voice. A momentous announcement. A grand scheme. More than grand. Grandiose, most would say. He might have said he intended to take an afternoon stroll for all of Min's reaction. She simply looked at him, hands folded on the pommel of her saddle, until he went on. I don't know how long it will take, and once I start, I think everyone within 1,000 miles of me who can channel will know something is happening. I doubt I'll be able to just stop if Deshiva and the rest, or the Forsaken, suddenly appear to see what it is. The Forsaken, I can't do anything about. But with luck, I can finish the others. Maybe being Taviran would give him the edge he needed so desperately. Depend on luck, and Corlin Deshiva or the Forsaken, either one will have you for breakfast, she said, turning her horse out of the clearing. "Maybe I can think of a better way. Come on. There's a warm fire at that inn. I hope you're going to let us have a hot meal before we leave." Rand stared after her incredulously. You would have thought 5 renegade Asherman, not to mention the Forsaken, were less bothered than a sore tooth. Booting the gray ahead in a spray of snow, he caught up to her and rode in silence. He still had a few secrets from her. This sickness that had begun affecting him when he channeled, for one. That was the real reason he had to deal with Jashiva and the others first. It gave him time to get over the sickness, if that was possible. If not, he was not sure the 2 Tirangrial riding behind his saddle were going to be any use at all. Chapter 1. Leaving the Prophet. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose above the Arith Ocean. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time. But it was a beginning. East the wind blew, and gray-green ocean swells toward Taraban, where ships already unloaded or wanting their turns to enter the harbor of Tanchico tossed at anchor for miles along the low coastline. More ships, great and small, filled the huge harbor, and barges ferrying people and cargo ashore, for there was no mooring empty at the city's docks. The inhabitants of Tanchico had been fearful when the city fell to its new masters with their peculiar customs and strange creatures, and women held on leashes who could channel, and fearful again when this fleet arrived, mind-numbing in its size, and began dislodging not only soldiers, but shoppers, merchants, and craftsfolk, trades, and even families with wagons and unknown plants. There was enough king and town who ordered the law. If king and panarch owed fealty to some far distant empress, if Shanchan nobles occupied many of the palaces, and demanded people of their faith, then any Taraban or lord life was little changed, except for the better. The Shanchan blood had small contact with ordinary folk, and odd customs could be lived with. The anarchy that had ripped the country apart was just a memory now, and fungi with it. The rebels and bandits and dragons sworn, who had plagued the land, were dead or captured or driven north onto Almath, those who had not yielded. The trade moved once more. The hordes of starving refugees that had clogged the city streets were back in their villages, back on their farms, and no more of the newest arrivals remained in Tanchico than the city could support easily. Despite the snows, soldiers and merchants, craftsfolk and farmers fanned out inland in their thousands and tens of thousands, but the icy wind lashed Tanchico at peace, and, after its harsh troubles, for the most part content with its lot. East the wind blew for leagues, gusting and fading, dividing but never dying, east and veering to the south, across forests and plains wrapped in winter, bare-branched and brown-grassed. The last crossing had once been the border between Taraban and Amadisia. A border still, but only in name, the customs posts dismantled, the guards gone. East and south, around the southern reaches of the Mountains of Mist, swirling across high-walled Amador. Conquered Amador. The banner atop the massive Fortress of the Light snapped in the wind, the golden hawk it bore truly seeming to fly with lightning bolts clutched in its talons. Few natives left their homes except at need, and those few hurried along the frozen streets, cloaks clutched around them and eyes down. Eyes down not just to mind footing on slick paving stones, but to avoid looking at the occasional shaman riding by on a beast bronze-scaled of a horse, or steel-veiled Tarabaners guarding groups of one-time children of the light, now chained and laboring like animals to haul refuse wagons out of the city. A bare month and a half in the Shanchan fold, the people of Amadisia's capital city felt the bitter wind like a scourge, and those who did not curse their fate meditated on what sins had brought them to this. East, the wind howled over a desolated land, where as many villages lay burned and farms ruined as held people. Snow blanketed charred timbers and abandoned barns alike, softening the view even as it added freezing to starvation as a way of dying. Sword and axe and spear had been there already, and remained to kill again. East, until the wind moaned a dirge over unwalled Avila. No banners flew above the town's watchtowers, for the prophet of the Lord Dragon was there, and the prophet needed no banner save his name. In Avila, people shivered harder at the name of the prophet than they did for the wind. People elsewhere shivered at that name too. Striding out of the tall merchant's house where Masima lived, Perrin let the wind whip his fur-lined cloak as he pulled on his gloves. The midday sun gave no warmth, and the air bit deep. He kept his face smooth, but he was too angry to feel the cold. Keeping his hands from the axe at his belt was an effort. Masima, he would not call the man prophet, not in his own head he would not. Masima was very likely a fool, and very certainly insane. A powerful fool, more powerful than most kings, and mad with it. Masima's guards filled the street from side to side and stretched around the corners of the next streets, bony fellows in stolen silks, beardless apprentices in torn coats, once plump merchants in the remains of fine woolens. Their breath was white mist, some shivered without a cloak, but every man clutched a spear or a crossbow with the bolt in place. Still, none looked outwardly hostile. They knew he claimed acquaintance with the prophet, and they gaped as if expecting him to leap into the air and fly, or at least turn somersaults. He filtered out the smell of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. A lot of them stank of old sweat and unwashed bodies, of eagerness and fear, and of a strange fever he had not recognized before, a reflection of the madness in Masima. Hostile or not, they would kill him, or anyone, at Masima's word. They would butcher nations at Masima's word. Smelling them, he felt a coldness deeper than any wind. He was gladder than ever that he had refused to let Fail come with him. The men he had left with the mounts were playing at dice alongside the animals, or going through the motions of it on a space of paving stones scraped mostly clear of snowy slush. He did not trust Masima as far as he could throw his bay, and nor did they. They were paying more mind to the house and the guards than to their game. The three warders sprang to their feet as soon as he appeared, their eyes going to his companions coming out behind him. They knew what their Aes Sedai had felt inside there. Niald was slower, pausing to scoop up the dice and coins. The Ashaman was a popinjay, always stroking his curled mustaches, strutting and smirking at women, but he stood on the balls of his feet now, wary as a cat.
I thought we'd have to fight our way out of there for a time,
Elias murmured at Perrin's shoulder. His golden eyes were calm, though. A lanky old man in a broad-brimmed hat with graying hair that hung down his back to his waist and a long beard fanning across his chest. A long knife at his belt, not a sword. But he had been a warder. He still was, in a way. That's the only thing that went right, Perrin told him, taking Stayer's reins from Niald. The Ashaman quirked an eyebrow questioningly, but Perrin shook his head, not caring what the question was, and Niald, with a twist to his mouth, handed Elias the reins of his mouse-colored gelding before climbing onto his own dapple. Perrin had no time for the Mirandian's sulks. Rand had sent him to bring back Masima, and Masima was coming. As always, when he thought of Rand, colors swirled in his head, and as always, he ignored them. Masima was too great a problem for Perrin to waste thought fretting over colors. The bloody man thought it blasphemy for anyone but Rand to touch the One Power. Rand, it seemed, was not really mortal. He was the light made flesh. So there would be no traveling, no quick leap to Kyrian through a gateway made by one of the Ashaman, no matter how Perrin had tried to bring Masima around. They would have to ride the whole 400 leagues or more, through the light alone knew what, and keep it secret who they were, and Masima as well. Those had been Rand's orders. "There's only one way I can see to do it, boy," Elias said, as if he had spoken aloud. "A slim chance. We might have had better odds knocking the fellow on the head and fighting clear anyway." "I know," Perrin growled. He had thought of it more than once during the hours of argument. With Ashaman and Aes Sedai and Wise Ones all channeling, it might have been possible. But he had seen a battle fought with the One Power, and ripped to blood-soaked shreds in the blink of an eye, the earth itself blooming in fire. Abila would have been a butcher's yard before they were done. He would never look on the like again if he had his way. "What do you think this prophet will make of it?" Elias asked. Perrin had to clear his mind of Demise Wells, and Abila looking like the field at Demise Wells, before he could think of what Elias was talking about. Oh. How was he going to do the impossible? "I don't care what he makes of it. The man would make trouble, that was for certain sure." Irritably, he rubbed at his beard. He needed to trim it. To have it trimmed, rather. If he picked up the scissors, Fail would take them away and give them to Lamgwin. It still seemed impossible that that hulking shoulder thumper with his scarred face and sunken knuckles could have the skills of a body servant. Light, a body servant. He was finding his footing with Fail and her strange Saldean ways, but the better his footing, the more she managed to run things to suit herself. Women always did that anyway, of course, but sometimes he thought he had exchanged one sort of whirlwind for another. Maybe he could try some of this masterful shouting she seemed to like so much. A man ought to be able to put scissors to his own beard if he wanted. He doubted he would, though. Shouting at her was hard enough when she began shouting first. Fool thing to be thinking about now, anyway. He studied the others making their way to the horses, as he would have studied tools he needed for a hard job of work. He was afraid Masima would make this journey as bad a job as he had ever taken on, and his tools were full of cracks. Seonid and Masuri paused beside him, the hoods of their cloaks pulled well forward, putting their faces in shadow. A razor-sharp quivering laced the faint scent of their perfumes, fear under control. Masima would have killed them on the spot if he had had his way. The guards still might, if any recognized an Aes Sedai face. Among this many, there had to be some who could. Masuri was taller by almost a hand, but Perrin still looked down on the tops of their heads. Ignoring Elias, the sisters exchanged glances, sheltered within their cowls. Then Masuri spoke quietly. "Do you see now why he must be killed? The man is rabid." Well, the Brown was seldom one to mince words. Luckily, none of the guards was close enough to overhear. "You could choose a better place to say that," he said. He did not want to hear the arguments again, now or later, but especially not now. And it seemed he did not have to. Idara and Karel loomed behind the Aes Sedai, dark shawls already wrapped around their heads. The bits that hung down across chest and back hardly seemed any protection from the cold, but then snow bothered the Wise Ones more, just the existence of such a thing. Their sun-dark faces might have been carved, for all they revealed, yet the scent of them was a steel spike. Idara's blue eyes, usually so composed that they seemed odd set in her youthful features, were as hard as that spike. Of course, her composure masked steel, sharp steel. "This is no place for talking," Karel told the Aes Sedai mildly, tucking a strand of fiery red hair beneath her shawl. As tall as many men, she was always mild, for a wise one, which only meant she did not bite your nose off without giving warning first. "Get to your horses." And the shorter women curtsied to her briefly and hurried to their saddles as if they were not Aes. They were not, to the Wise Ones. Aaron thought he would never grow accustomed to that, even if Masuri and Seonid seemed to have done so. With a sigh, he swung up onto Stayer as the Wise Ones followed their Aes Sedai apprentices. The stallion frisked a few steps after his rest, but Perrin brought him under control with the pressure of his knees and steady hands on the reins. The Aiel women mounted awkwardly, Even after all the practice they had had these past weeks, their heavy skirts pushed up to bare, wool-stockinged legs above the knee. They agreed with the two sisters about Masima, and so did the other wise ones back at his camp. A fine boiling stew for anyone to carry to Kyrien without being scalded. Grady and Aram were already mounted, to make out their sense among all the others. There was He'd always thought Grady looked a fine with his black coat and silver sword on his collar, but no. Statue still in his saddle, the Ironman surveyed the guards with the grim eyes of a man deciding where to make the first cut. And the second, and the third, and however many were needed. Aram, bilious green tinker's cloak flailing the wind as he handled his reins, the hilt of his sword rising above his shoulder, Aram's face was a map of excitement that made Perrin's heart sink. In Masima, Aram had met a man who had given his life and heart and soul to the Dragon Reborn. In Aram's view, the Dragon Reborn ranked close behind Perrin and Fail. You did the boy no favor, Elias had told Perrin. You helped him let go of what he believed, and now all he has to believe in are you and that sword. It's not enough. Not for any man. Elias had known Aram when Aram was still a tinker, before he picked up the sword. A stew that might have poison in it for some. The guards might gaze at Perrin in wonder, but they did not move to clear a passage until someone shouted from a window of the house. Then they edged aside enough for the riders to leave single file. Reaching the prophet was not easy without his permission. Without his permission, leaving him was impossible. Once away from Masima and his guards, Perrin set as fair a pace as he could through the crowded streets. Avila had been a large, prosperous town not so long ago, with its stone marketplaces and slate-roofed buildings as tall as 4 stories. It was still large, but mounds of rubble marked where those houses and inns had been torn down. Not an inn remained standing in Avila, or a house where someone had been slow to proclaim the glory of the Lord Dragon Reborn. Masima's disapproval was never subtle. The throng held few who looked as if they lived in the town, drab folk in drab clothes for the most part, scuttling fearfully along the sides of the street, and no children. No dogs either. Hunger was a likely problem in this place now. Everywhere groups of armed men straggled through the ankle-deep muck that had been snow last night. 20 here, 50 there, knocking down people too slow to get out of their path, even making the ox carts wend around them. There were always hundreds in sight. There had to be thousands in the town. Masima's army was a rabble, but their numbers had made up for other lacks so far. Thank the light, the man had agreed to bring along only 100. It had taken an hour's argument, but he had agreed. In the end, Masima's desire to reach Rand quickly, even if he would not travel, had won the point. Few of his followers had horses, and the more they came afoot, the slower they would go. At least, he would arrive at Perrin's camp by nightfall. Perrin saw no one mounted except his own party, and they drew stares from the armed men, stony stares, fevered stares. Finely dressed folk came to the prophet often enough, nobles and merchants, hoping a submission in person would gain more blessings and fewer penalties. But they usually departed afoot. Their way was unimpeded, however, aside from the necessity of riding around the clumps of Masima's followers. If they left mounted, it must be by Masima's will. Even so, Perrin had no need to tell anyone to stay close. There was a feel of waiting in Avila. No one with half a brain would want to be near when the waiting ended. It was a relief when Balwer kneed his hammer-nosed gelding out of a side street, just short of the low wooden bridge that led out of town, almost as great as the relief he felt when they had crossed the bridge and passed the last guards. The pinch-faced little man, all knobby joints, and with his plain brown coat more hanging on him than worn, could look after himself in spite of appearances, but Fail was setting up a proper household for a noblewoman, and she would be more than displeased if Perrin let any harm come to her secretary. Hers and Perrin's. Perrin was not sure how he felt about having a secretary, yet the fellow possessed skills beyond writing a fine hand. which he demonstrated as soon as they were clear of the town, with low, forested hills all around. Most of the branches were stark and bare, and those that retained leaf or needle splashed a vivid green against the white. They had the road to themselves, but snow, frozen in ruts, kept their riding slow. "Forgive me, my Lord Baron," Bulwer murmured, leaning in his saddle to peer past Elias, "but I happened to overhear something back there you might find of interest." He coughed discreetly into his glove, then hurriedly recaptured his cloak and pulled it close. Elias and Aram hardly needed Perrin's gesture to fall back with the others. Everyone was accustomed to the dry little man's desire for privacy. Why he wanted to pretend that no one else knew he ferreted out information at every town or village they passed, Perrin could not begin to guess. He had to know that Perrin discussed what he learned with Vail and Elias. In any case, he was very good at ferreting. Bulwer tilted his head to one side to watch Perrin as they rode side by side. "I have 2 pieces of news, my lord. One, I believe, important, and one urgent." Urgent or not, even the fellow's voice sounded dry, like dead leaves rustling. How urgent? Perrin made a wager with himself over who the first piece of news would be about. "Very, perhaps, my lord. King Ailron has brought the Shonchan to battle near the town of Jeremel, approximately 100 miles west of here. This was about 10 days ago." Bulwer's mouth pursed momentarily in irritation. He disliked imprecision. He disliked not knowing. "Reliable information is scarce, but without doubt, the Amadisian army is dead, captive, or scattered. I would be very surprised if more than 100 remain together anywhere, and those will take to banditry soon enough. Ailron himself was taken, along with his entire court. Amadisia no longer has any nobility, not to amount to anything." Mentally, Perrin marked the wager lost. Usually, Bulwer began with news of the White Cloaks. "A pity for Amadisia, I suppose. For the people captured, anyway." According to Bulwer, the Shonchan had a harsh way with those captured under arms opposing them. So, Amadisia had no army left, and no nobles to raise or lead it. Nothing to stop the Shonchan spreading as fast as they wished, though they seemed to spread very quickly, even when there was opposition. Best if he rode east as soon as Massima reached the camp, and then moved as fast as he could for as long as the men and horses could sustain it. He said as much, and Bulwer nodded, with a thin smile of approval. The man appreciated it when Perrin saw the value of what he reported. "One other point, my lord," he went on. "The White Cloaks took part in the battle, but apparently Balda managed to get most of them off the field at the end. He has the Dark One's own luck. No one seems to know where they have gone, or rather, every tongue gives a different direction. If I may say so, I favor east, away from the Shonchan, and toward Abila, of course." The wager was not a loss then, though the man had not begun with it. A draw, maybe. Far ahead, a hawk soared high in the cloudless sky, heading north. It would reach the camp long before he would. Perrin could recall a time when he had had as few concerns as that hawk. Compared to now, at least. It had been a very long time ago. "I suspect the White Cloaks are more interested in avoiding the Shonchan than in bothering us, Bulwer. Anyway, I can't move any faster for them than for the Shonchan. Were they the second piece of news?" "No, my lord. Simply a point of interest." Bulwer seemed to hate the Children of the Light, most especially Balda. A matter of rough treatment somewhere in his past, Perrin suspected. But like everything else about the man, it was a dry, cold hate. Passionless. "The second news is that the Shonchan have fought another battle, this in southern Altara. Against Aes Sedai, possibly, though some mentioned men channeling." Half turning in his saddle, Bulwer looked back at Grady and Niald in their black coats. Grady was in conversation with Elias, and Niald with Aram, but both Ashaman appeared to be keeping as close an eye on the forests as did the warders bringing at the rear. The Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones were talking in low voices too. Whoever they fought, my lord, it is clear that the Shan-Chan lost and were sent reeling back into Abu Dahar. Good news, Perrin said flatly. Dumai's wells flashed into his head again, stronger than before. For a moment, he was back-to-back with Loyal again, fighting desperately, sure that every breath would be his last. For the first time that day, he shivered. At least Rand knew about the Shan-Chan. At least he did not have to worry about that. He became aware of Balwar eyeing him, considering him like a bird considering a strange insect. He had seen him shiver. The little man liked to know everything, but there were some secrets no one would ever know. Perrin's eyes returned to the hawk, barely visible now even to him. It made him think of Fail, his fierce falcon of a wife, his beautiful falcon of a wife. He put Shan-Chan in white cloaks and battle, and even Masima out of his mind. For the time, at least. Let's pick up the pace a little, he called back to the others. The hawk might see Fail before he did, but unlike the bird, he would be seeing the love of his heart. And today, he would not shout at her, no matter what she did. Chapter 2. Taken. The hawk soon passed out of sight, and the road remained empty of other travelers, but press as Perrin would, frozen ruts ready to break a horse's leg and a rider's neck allowed no great speed. The wind carried ice and a promise of snow again tomorrow. It was mid-afternoon by the time he turned off through the trees into white drifts that were knee-deep on the horses in places, covered the last mile to the forest camp where he had left the two riversmen and the Aiel, the Mayenners, and Gildanin. And Fail. Nothing there was as he expected. As always, there were 4 camps, spaced out among the trees, in truth, but the winged guards smoking campfires stood abandoned around Verlaine's striped tents, amid overturned kettles and bits of gear dropped on the snow, and the same signs of haste dotted the trampled ground where Alejandro's soldiers had been set up when he left that morning. The only evidence of life in either place was the horse handlers and farriers and cart drivers, bundled in woolens and huddled in clumps near the horse lines and around the supply carts. They were all staring toward what caught his eye and held it. 500 paces from the rocky, flat-topped hill where the Wise Ones had placed their low tents, the gray-coated Mayenners were drawn up, all 900 or so of them, horses stamping impatiently, red cloaks and the long red streamers on their lances rippling in the cold breeze. Nearer the hill and off to one side, just at the near bank of a frozen stream, the Gildanin made a block of lances just as large, these with green streamers. The mounted soldiers' green coats and armor appeared drab compared with the Mayenners' red helmets and breastplates. Their officers sparkled in silvered armor and scarlet coats and cloaks, with reins and saddlecloths fringed in crimson. A brave show for men on parade, but they were not parading. The winged guards faced toward the Gildanin toward the hill, and the crest of the hill was ringed by 2 riversmen, longbows in hand. No one had drawn yet, but every man had a shaft nocked and ready. It was madness. Booting Stair to as near a trot as the bay could manage, Perrin plowed through the snow, followed by the others, until he reached the head of the Gildanin formation. Verlaine was there, in a fur-trimmed red cloak, and Galen, the one-eyed captain of her winged guards, and Anura, her Aes Sedai advisor, all apparently arguing with Alejandro's first captain, a short, hard-bitten fellow named Gerard Arganda, who was shaking his head so hard the fat white plumes quivered on his gleaming helmet. The first of Mayenne looked ready to bite iron. Vexation showed through Anura's Aes Sedai calm, and Galen was fingering the red-plumed helmet hanging at his saddle as though deciding whether to don it. At the sight of Perrin, they broke off and turned their mounts toward him. Verlaine had her saddle erect, but her black hair was wind-blown, and her fine-ankled white mare was shivering, a lather of a hard run freezing on her flanks. With so many people about, it was all but impossible to make out individual sense, but Perrin did not need his nose to recognize trouble hanging by a hair. Before he could demand to know what in the light they thought they were doing, Verlaine spoke with a porcelain-faced formality that made him blink at first. "Lord Perrin, your lady wife and I were hunting with Queen Alejandra when we were attacked by Aiel. I managed to escape. No one else in the party has returned yet, though it may be the Aiel took prisoners. I have sent a squad of lancers to scout. We were about 10 miles to the southeast, so they should return with news by nightfall." "Aiel was captured?" Perrin said thickly. Even before crossing into Amadicia from Galedan, they had heard of Aiel burning and looting, but it had always been somewhere else, the next village over, or the one beyond that, if not farther. Never close enough to worry about, or to be sure they were more than rumor. Not when he had Rand Bloody Al Thor's orders to carry out. And look what it had cost. "Why are you all still here?" he demanded aloud. "Why aren't you all searching for her?" He realized he was shouting. He wanted to howl, to savage them. "Burn you all? What are you waiting for?" The levelness of her reply, as if reporting how much fodder was left for the horses, pushed needles of rage into his head. The more so because she was right. "We were ambushed by 200 or 300, Lord Perrin, perhaps more. But you know as well as I, from what we have heard, there easily could be a dozen such bands roaming the countryside. If we pursue in force, we may find a battle that will cost us heavily against Aiel, without even knowing whether they are the ones who hold you, maybe, or even if she still... We must know Lord Perrin, or the rest is worse than useless. If she still lived." He shivered. The cold was inside him suddenly, in his bones, his heart. She had to be alive. She had to be. Oh, Light, he should have let her come to Abilah with him. Anura's wide-mouthed face was a mask of sympathy, framed by thin Terabonner braids. Suddenly, he became aware of pain in his hands, cramping on the reins. He forced them to loosen their grip, flexed his fingers inside his gauntlets. "She's right," Elias said quietly, moving his gelding closer. "Hold on to yourself. Blunder around with Aiel and you're asking to die. Maybe taking a lot of men with you to a bad end. Dying does no good if it leaves your wife a prisoner." He tried to make his voice lighter, but Perrin could smell the strain. "Anyway, we'll find her, boy. She could well have escaped them, and a woman like that. Be trying to make her way back here afoot. Take time, that would, in a dress. The first scouts will locate traces." Raking fingers through his long beard, Elias gave a self-deprecating chuckle. "If I can't find more than the Mayenners, I'll eat bark. We'll get it back for you." Perrin was not fooled. "Yes," he said harshly. "Nobody could escape Aiel afoot. Go now. Hurry." Not fooled at all. The man expected to find Fail's body. She had to be alive, and that meant captive. But better a prisoner than...
1 second, everyone.
They could not talk between themselves as they did with wolves, but Elias hesitated as if he understood Perrin's thoughts. He did not try to deny them, though. His gelding set off southeast at a walk. After a quick glance at Perrin, Aram followed, his face dark. The one-time tinker did not like Elias, but he near enough worshipped Fail, if only because she was Perrin's wife. It would do no good to founder the animals, Perrin told himself, frowning at their retreating backs. He wanted them to run. He wanted to run with them. Fine cracks seemed to be spidering through him. If they returned with the wrong news, he would shatter. To his surprise, the 3 warders trotted their mounts through the trees after Elias and Aram in splashes of snow, then matched speed when they caught up. He managed to give Masuri and Seonit a grateful nod, and included Idara and Karel. Whoever had made the suggestion, there was no doubt who had granted permission. It was a measure of the control the Wise Ones had established that neither sister was trying to take charge. Very likely they wanted to, but their gloved hands remained folded on the pommels of their saddles, and neither betrayed impatience by so much as the flicker of an eyelid. Not everyone was watching the departing men. Anura alternated between beaming sympathy at him and studying the wise ones out of the corner of her eye. Unlike the other two sisters, she had made no promises, but she was almost as circumspect with the Aiel would say. Galen's one eye was on Berelain, awaiting a sign he should draw the sword he was gripping, while she was intent on Perrin, her face still smooth and unreadable. Grady and Niald had their heads together, casting quick, grim glances in his direction. Bulwer sat very still, like a sparrow perched on the saddle, trying to be invisible, listening intently. Arganda pushed his tall roan gelding past Galen's heavy-chested black, ignoring the Mayenner's one-eyed glare of outrage. The first captain's mouth worked angrily behind the shining face bars of his helmet, but Perrin heard nothing. Fail filled his head. Oh, light Fail. His chest felt bound with iron straps. He was near to panic, holding to the precipice with his fingernails. Desperately, he reached out with his mind, frantically searching for wolves. Elias must have tried this already. Elias would not have given way to panic at the news, but he had to try himself. Searching, he found them. Three Toes Pack and Cold Waters, Twilights and Springhorns, and others. Pain flowed out with his plea for help, but grew greater inside him rather than less. They had heard of young Bull, and they commiserated over the loss of his she, but they kept clear of the Two Legs, who frightened away all the game and were death for any wolf caught alone. There were so many packs of Two Legs about, afoot and riding the hard-footed Forelegs, that they could not say whether any they knew of were the one he sought. Two Legs were Two Legs to them, indistinguishable except for those who could channel, and the few who could speak with them. Mourn, they told him, and move on, and meet her again in the wolf dream. One by one, the images that his mind turned to words faded away until only one lingered. Mourn, and meet her again in the wolf dream. Then that also was gone. "Are you listening?" Arganda demanded roughly. He was not a smooth-faced noble, and despite his silks and the gold work atop the silver of his breastplate, he looked like what he was, a graying soldier who had first hefted a lance as a boy and probably carried 24 scars. His dark eyes were almost as fevered as those of Massima's men. He smelled of rage and fear. "Those savages took Queen Aleandra as well." "We will find your queen when we find my wife," Perrin said, his voice as cold and hard as the edge of his axe. She had to be alive. "Suppose you tell me what all this is about. You've drawn up ready to charge, it looks like, and facing my people at that." He had other responsibilities, too. Acknowledging that was bitter as gall. Nothing else counted alongside Fail. Nothing. But the Two Rivers men were his people. Arganda dashed his mount close and seized Perrin's sleeve in a gauntleted fist. "You listen to me. The First Lady Berelain says it was Aiel took Queen Aleandra, and there are Aiel sheltering behind those archers of yours. I have men who will be happy enough to put them to question." His heated gaze swung back to Adara and Karel for a moment. Perhaps he was thinking that they were Aiel with no archers barring his path. "The first captain is overwrought," Verlaine murmured, laying a hand on Perrin's other arm. "I have explained to him that none of the Aiel here were involved. I'm sure that I can convince him." He shook her off, ripped his sleeve away from the Yeldanan. "Aleandra swore fealty to me, Arganda. You swore fealty to her, and that makes me your lord. I said I'll find Aleandra when I find Fail." The edge of an axe. She was alive. "You question no one, touch no one, unless I say. What you will do is take your men back to your camp, now, and be ready to ride when I give the order. If you're not ready when I call, you will be left behind." Arganda stared at him, breathing hard. His eyes straight again, this time toward the two Ashaman, then jerked back to Perrin's face. "As you command, my lord," he said stiffly. Wheeling his roan, he shouted orders to his officers, and was already galloping away before they began issuing their own. The Geel Danann began to peel away by columns, riding after their first captain. Toward their camp, though whether Arganda intended to remain there was anyone's guess, and whether it might not be for the worse if he did. "You handled that very well, Perrin," Berelain said. "A difficult situation, and a painful time for you. Not formal at all now. Just a woman full of pity, her smile compassionate. Oh, she had 1,000 guises, Berelain did." She stretched out a red-gloved hand, and he backed Stayer away before she could touch him. "Give it over, burn you," he snarled. "My wife has been taken. I've no patience for your childish games." She jerked as if he had struck her. Color bloomed in her cheeks, and she changed again, becoming supple and willowy in her saddle. "Not childish, Perrin," she murmured, her voice rich and amused. "Two women contesting over you, and you the prize? I would think you'd be flattered. Attend me, Lord Captain Galen. I suppose we too should be ready to ride at command." The one-eyed man rode back toward the wayfarers at her side, moving as close to a canter as the snow made possible. He was leaning toward her as if hearing instructions.
What do you mean by
where she
taking
was,
gas
gathering
tonight?
reins of her brown mare. Her mouth was a razored line beneath her beak of a nose. "Sometimes you are a very large fool, Perrin Aybara. Quite often, in fact." He did not know what she was talking about, and did not care. At times, she seemed resigned to Berelain chasing after a married man, and other times amused by it, even helping out by arranging for Berelain to be alone with him. Right then, First and Aes Sedai both disgusted him. Healing Stayer in the flanks,
I'm not sure how to do this on Twitch. I'm still new to
the men on the hilltop opened enough to let him through,
this.
muttering to one another, watching the Lancers below
Cook some
ride toward their
video games.
respective camps, parted again to let the wise ones in Aes Sedai and Ashaman pass. They did not break up and crowd around him as he had expected, for which he was grateful.
At the age you
The
are
whole
at, I'll probably
hilltop smelled
quit
of
it, dude.
wariness. Most of it did. The snow atop the hill had been trampled until some patches were clear except for frozen clumps.
It's gotta be 18 and over, dude.
The four wise ones who had remained behind when he rode to Avila were standing in front of one of the low Aiel tents, tall, unruffled women with dark woolen shawls around their shoulders, watching the two sisters dismount with Karel and Adara, and seemingly paying no mind to what was going on around them. The Gashain who served them in place of servants were going about their normal tasks quietly, meekly, faces hidden in the deep collars of their white robes. One fellow was even beating a carpet hung over a rope tied between two trees. The only sign among the Aiel that they might have been on the brink of a fight was Gaul and the maidens. They had been squatting on their heels, shufa around their heads and black veils hiding all but their eyes, short spears and bullhide bucklers in hand. As Perrin jumped down from his saddle, they rose. Dan'l Luwin trotted up, chewing worriedly at the thick mustache that made his nose look even bigger than it was. He carried his bow and was sliding an arrow back into the quiver at his belt. "I didn't know what else to do, Perrin," he said in a jerky voice. Dan'l had been at Dumai's Wells and faced
I'm not watching anything, I'm just have an audiobook playing.
By the time we found out what happened, those Geel Danann fellows were already starting this way, so I sent off John Dinbar and a couple of others, you, Marwyn, and get Elia,
StreamYard
the Carianan and your servants to make a circle with the carts and stay
Twitch, I don't know how to do that.
Had to just about tie up those folks who were always following Lady Fail around. They wanted to go up after her, and not a one of them knows a footprint from an oak tree.
Watching
and I brought everybody
or listening to a book.
I thought those Geel Danann might charge us, until the first got there with her men. They must be crazy, thinking any of our Aiel would hurt the Lady Fail. Even when they Perrined him, Fail nearly always received the honorific from the Two Rivers men. "You did right, Daniel," Perrin said, tossing him Stayer's reins. "You and Get were good woodsmen, and John Dinbaran could follow yesterday's wind." Gall and the maidens were starting to leave in single file. They were still veiled. "Tell off 1 man in 3 to stay here," Perrin told Daniel hurriedly. Just because he had faced Arganda down,
I usually don't do streams like that.
"And send the rest back to pack up. I want to ride as soon as there's word." Without waiting on a reply, he hurried to put himself in front of Gall and stopped the taller man with a hand to his chest. For some reason, Gall's green eyes tightened above his veil. Sulin and the rest of the maidens strung out behind him went up on the balls of their feet. "Find her for me, Gall," Perrin said. "All of you, please find who took her. If anyone can track Aiel, it's you." The tightness in Gall's eyes vanished as suddenly as it had come, and the maidens relaxed too. As much as Aiel ever could be said to relax. It was very strange. They could not think he blamed them in any way. "We all wake from the dream one day," Gall said gently. "But if she still dreams, we will find her. But if Aiel took her, we must go. They will move quickly. Even in this." He put considerable disgust in the word, kicking at a clod of snow. Perrin nodded and hastily stepped aside, letting the Aiel set out at a trot. He doubted they could maintain that for very long, but he was sure they would keep the pace longer than anyone else could have. As the maidens passed him, each quickly pressed fingers to the veil over her lips, then touched his shoulder. Sulin, right behind Gall, gave him a nod as well, but none said a word. Fail would have known what they meant with their finger-kissing. There was something else odd about their departure, he realized, as the last maiden went by. They were letting Gall lead. Normally, any of them would have stuck a spear in him before allowing that. Why? Maybe Chiad and Bane would have been with Fail. Gall did not care one way or the other about Bane, but Chiad was a different matter. The maidens certainly had not been encouraging Gall's hope that Chiad would give up the spear to marry him. Anything but. Yet maybe that was it. Perrin grunted in disgust at himself.
Be right
Chiad
back,
and Bane,
everyone.
and who else? Even blind with fear for Fail, he should have asked that much. If he was going to get her back, he needed to strangle fear and see. But it was like trying to strangle a tree. The flat hilltop swarmed now. Someone had already led Stayer away, and Two Rivers men were leaving the ring around the crest, hurrying toward their camp in a scattered stream, shouting to one another about what they would have done had the Lancers charged. Occasionally a man raised his voice, asking about Fail. Did anyone know if the lady was safe? Were they going to look for her? But others always shushed him hurriedly, with worried glances at Perrin. The Gashine went about their tasks placidly in the middle of all the rush. Unless commanded to stop, they would have done the same if a battle had swirled around them, not raising a hand to help or hinder. The wise ones had all gone into one of the tents with Seonid and Missouri, and the flaps were not only down, but tied. They did not want to be disturbed. They would be discussing Massima, no doubt, possibly discussing how to kill the man without him or Rand learning they had done it. He smacked a fist into his palm in irritation. He had actually forgotten Massima until now. The man was supposed to be following before nightfall with that honor guard of 100 men. With luck, the Mayaner scouts would be back by then, and Elias and the others soon after. "My lord Perrin," Grady said behind him, and he turned. The two Ashaman stood in front of their horses, fiddling uncertainly with their reins. Grady drew breath and went on, with Niall nodding agreement. "The pair of us could cover a lot of ground, traveling. And if we find the lot who kidnapped her, well, I doubt even a few hundred Aiel could stop two Ashaman from taking her back." Perrin opened his mouth to tell them to start immediately, then closed it again. Grady had been a farmer, true, but never a hunter or woodsman. Naald thought any place without a stone wall was a village. They might know a footprint from an oak tree, yet if they did find tracks, Very likely neither would be able to say which direction they were headed. Of course, he could go with them. He was not as good as Jondin, but he could go and leave Daniel to deal with Arganda and Massima, not to mention the Wise One's schemes. Go get yourselves packed, he said quietly. Where was Bulwer? Nowhere in sight. Not very likely that he had gone herring off to find Fail. You may be needed here. Brady blinked in surprise, and the elf's mouth dropped open. Perrin gave them no chance to argue. He strode over to the low tent with the tied flaps. There was no way to undo the ties from the outside. When Wise Ones wanted to remain undisturbed, they wanted to remain undisturbed by clan chiefs or anyone else, including a wetlander lumbered with the unwanted title of Lord of the Two Rivers. He drew his belt knife and bent to slice the ties, but before he could slide the blade through the tight crack between the entry flaps, they jerked as if someone was unfastening them from inside. He straightened and waited. The tent flaps opened, and Navarin slipped out. Her shawl was tied around her waist, but except for the mist of her breath, she gave no evidence of the icy air. Her green eyes took in the knife in his hand, and she planted her fists on her hips in a rattle of bracelets. She was near enough bone thin, with long sandy yellow hair held back by a dark folded kerchief, and more than a hand taller than Nynaeve, but that was who she always made him think of. She stood blocking the entrance to the tent. You are impetuous, Perrin Ebara. Her light voice was level, but he had the impression that she was considering boxing his ears, very much like Nynaeve. Though that might be understandable in the circumstances. What do you want? How? He had to stop to swallow. How will they treat her? I cannot say, Perrin Ebara. There was no sympathy on her face, no expression at all. Aiel could give Aes Sedai lessons in that. Taking wetlanders captive is against custom, except for tree killers, though that has changed. So is killing without need or cause. But many have refused to accept the truths the Karakan revealed. Some were taken by the bleakness and threw down their spears, yet they may have taken them up again. Others simply left, to live as they believe we are meant to. I cannot say what customs might be kept or abandoned by those who have abandoned clan and sect. The only emotion she betrayed was a hint of disgust at the end for those who had abandoned clan and sect. Light woman, you must have some idea. Surely you can make a guess. Do not become irrational, she broke in sharply. Men often do in such situations, but we have need of you. I think it will do your standing with the other wetlanders no good if we must bind you until you calm down. Go to your tent. If you cannot control your thoughts, drink until you cannot think. And do not bother us when we are in council. She ducked back into the tent, and the flaps jerked closed and began to twitch as they were tied again. Perrin considered the closed flaps, running his thumb over the blade of his knife, then shoved it into the sheath. They just might do as Navarin had threatened if he barged in. And they could not tell him anything he wanted to know. He did not think she would keep secrets at a time like this. Not about Fail, anyway. The hilltop had grown quieter, with most of the Two Rivers men gone. Still watchful of the gale, stamped their feet against the cold, but no one talked. The scurrying Gaishain hardly made a sound. Trees obscured parts of the Geldanan and Mayaner camps, but Perrin could see carts being loaded in both. He decided to leave men on guard anyway. Arganda could be trying to lull him. A man who smelled like that could be irrational. He finished the thought dryly. There was nothing left for him to do on the hill, so he set out to walk the half-mile to his tent, the tent he shared with Fail. He stumbled as much as walked, laboring when the snow rose around his legs. As much to stop it snapping in the wind as for warmth, and his clothes tied around him. There was no warmth. The Two Rivers camp was aswarm with activity when he arrived. Hunters made a big circle, with Cameron's estates back in Carrion loading them, and others readying horses for saddling. In this depth of snow, cartwheels might as well have tried to roll through mud, so they were all lashed to the sides of the carts now, replaced by pairs of broad wooden sleds. Bundled against the weather till most seemed twice as wide as they really were, the Carrienan hardly paused to glance at him, but every Two Rivers man who saw him stopped to stare until someone else prodded the fellow to get on with whatever he was about. Perrin was glad none gave words to the sympathy in those stares. He thought he might break down and cry, if anyone did. There seemed to be nothing for him to do here either. His big tent, his and Fail's, was already down and on a cart, along with its contents. Basil Gill was walking along the carts with a long list in his hands. The stout man had taken to the job of Chambean, running Fail's household, Perrin's, like a squirrel to a corn crib. More used to cities than traveling outside their walls, though, he suffered from the cold, and wore not only a cloak, but a thick scarf around his neck, a floppy-brimmed felt hat, and heavy woolen gloves. For some reason, Gill flinched at the sight of him, and mumbled something about seeing to the carts before hurrying off as fast as he could. Odd. Perrin did think of one thing then, and finding Daniel, he gave orders to relieve the men on the hill every hour and make sure everyone had a hot meal. "Take care of the men and horses first," a thin but strong voice said. "But then you must take care of yourself. There's hot soup in the kettle, and bread of a sort, and I've put by some smoked ham. A full belly will make you look less like murder walking." "Thank you, Linny," he said. Murder walking? Light. He felt like one of the dead, not a murderer. "I'll eat in a little while." Fail's chief maid was a frail-appearing woman with skin like parchment and white hair in a bun on top of her head, but her back was straight and her dark eyes were clear and sharp.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into the stream for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.